Need for Speed Heat was born from a necessary context of transition within the franchise, almost like a fan's cry for help for a more authentic experience, less filled with artificial mechanics. The Ghost Games studio, which had been responsible for somewhat forgettable previous titles, had the challenge of restoring public respect for the Need for Speed legacy, bringing back truly core elements, police chases, street culture, and a car customization focus that is missed when discarded. This pressure to deliver something more genuine was reflected in the setting of Palm City, a clear inspiration from Miami, full of neon, heat, and that atmosphere of rivalry and corrupt police typical of 80s movies. It is impossible to talk about this context without mentioning the conscious decision to forego microtransactions and loot boxes, a recurring criticism of Electronic Arts at the time. It was almost a disguised apology, only bringing in optional time savers. This demonstrates how the development of Need for Speed Heat was influenced by the player's demand for less monetized and more honest experiences, an attempt to clear the slate after controversies with Payback. In my perception, tinkering with this structure was a sign of maturity from the studio, recognizing errors and trying to strengthen the bond with the game's own community. On the technical side, the bet on the Frostbite 3 game engine was a logical step to ensure modern visuals and quality animations, but it also brought some limitation. Frostbite is known for being robust and complex, and its adaptation for racing games has always generated challenges in car physics and police artificial intelligence. It became easy to notice that, despite good intentions, there are moments when the chases are unpredictable or unfair. This, for me, reflects that classic dilemma between creativity and technical restrictions, where development ambition clashes with available time and resources. An aspect I consider a success was the inclusion of the NF's Heat Studio application, allowing players to collect and customize their cars even before the launch. This digital integration is part of the modern context of development focused on engagement and community, showing that the studio was attentive to bringing the player experience closer and making customization a truly important element, and not just an extra. It's a sign that development went beyond the main game, trying to give the public more tools to connect with automotive culture. The game stood out for its clear differentiation between day and night, something that Ghost Games brought as an important innovation for the franchise. This cycle doesn't work as a traditional dynamic system, where time passes naturally, but rather as a fixed choice the player makes when leaving the garage, deciding whether to race during the day or at night. This approach gave the game a freshness because it allowed exploring two distinct game modes, each with its own rules, rewards, and challenges. During the day, the gameplay is focused on official races, which are less risky, ideal for accumulating money, bank, the game's currency. At night, however, the adrenaline takes over, as illegal races bring a high risk due to police chases, but also bring a greater reward in the form of reputation, which is what truly unlocks upgrades and progression in the game. This alternation is, in my view, the heart of the Heat experience, as it forces the player to manage risks and rewards more carefully, giving a depth to the gameplay that was lacking in previous titles. In the development process, Ghost Games understood that placing this clear division would foster the feeling that the game has two faces, the clean and regulated side of daytime races and the uncertain and tense underworld of nighttime races. This dichotomy allowed for the creation of a living city that behaves in completely different ways during the day or night, making Palm City a character in its own right in the game. In development, they also implemented a safe return to base system at the end of night races, so that the player can tally their earnings and escape police consequences. This creates an almost strategic rhythm, where you must plan your escape before the risk of being caught increases too much. A very well-worked idea within the game's technical limitations. This detail reveals how Ghost Games wanted the player to truly feel the tension and danger of the illegal environment, and it's an extra layer of challenge that I highly value for bringing realism to the gameplay. In development, they also implemented a safe return to base system at the end of night races so that the player can tally their earnings and escape police consequences. This creates an almost strategic rhythm, where you must plan your escape before the risk of being caught increases too much. a very well-worked idea within the game's technical limitations. This detail reveals how Ghost games wanted the player to truly feel the tension and danger of the illegal environment, and it's an extra layer of challenge that I highly value for bringing realism to the gameplay. For me, what makes this Ghost game's innovation so striking is not just the technical implementation, but the way it reinforces a unique identity for the game within the franchise. The fact of allowing the player to choose the time of day to race works as a metaphor for the conflict between the legal and illegal side of street racing, bringing a narrative gameplay layer that goes beyond superficial aspects and places the player at the center of this duality. This type of innovation in game design is what makes Need for Speed Heat special and differentiated in the series. The narrative of Need for Speed Heat, for me, is one of the game's weakest points and ended up compromising the experience somewhat. The characters are extremely caricatured and irritating in a way that makes it difficult to care about them or what happens in the story. The villain, Lieutenant Mercer, is exaggeratedly stereotypical, giving the feeling that he was taken from a cliché 80s action movie without any complexity or subtlety. This makes the main conflict between street racers and the police seem forced, unconvincing, and the lack of depth in the characters' motivations further worsens emotional engagement. Another point that frustrated me was the hurried pace of the narrative. It seems like the story is thrown at the player without much construction, as if it were a pretext for the races, and this generates a feeling of superficiality. The dialogues not infrequently border on the ridiculous, often sounding artificial and without real purpose, which even hinders immersion in the game's atmosphere. For those looking for a weighty or involving plot, Heat disappoints considerably in this area, delivering a script that seems more like a formality than an integral part of the experience. The idealization of the street racers also bothered me a lot. The drivers are presented almost as innocent and wronged heroes, which doesn't make much sense within a drag racing culture normally loaded with conflict and a more raw attitude. This simplified view takes away the spice and veracity that a story of this type could have. I missed a greater diversity in the characters who could show different sides of this universe, with imperfections and nuances that would make each racer more realistic and interesting. As for the structure of the racing events, I found that it suffered from a lack of variety and creativity. The daytime races in particular seemed boring and repetitive to me, without that sparkle or challenge capable of holding interest for long. The gameplay there fails to capture the spirit of official races and seems to be reduced to fulfilling tasks without emotion, which made me quickly lose interest during these phases of the game. The lack of incentive and challenge in these daytime races contrasts greatly with what happens at night. Speaking of night races, there we do find something more animated and dynamic. The police chases create a tense and adrenaline-filled rhythm that truly brings novelty and excitement to the game, being one of the best aspects of the experience. The constant police pressure and the risk of losing everything create a unique atmosphere that held my attention much more than the daytime events. For me, this difference makes it clear that Ghost games got the night part right much more than the day, making the night the moment richest in gameplay, emotion, and challenge. The impression I have is that the development team let the story take a back seat, relying much more on the gameplay design and the setting to create the experience. This might even work for those who play just for the race, but for those who like a more engaging plot, Heat falls short. Perhaps this choice was motivated by the focus on mechanics and the attempt to regain the series' respect with the community, but this left the game with a somewhat hybrid and not very cohesive profile. The narrative of Need for Speed Heat is a clear weak point, with unbearable characters and a rhythm that doesn't allow the story to develop naturally. The lack of diversity in events and drivers only reinforces this impression of superficiality, although the night races and the police dynamic are a high point that manages to balance this lack a little. In my opinion, this game shines more for its mechanics and atmosphere creation than for the plot it tries to tell, and this ends up reflecting directly on player engagement with the story mode. The setting of Palm City in Need for Speed Heat is something that divides opinions, and I personally think it falls short during the day. Despite the proposal of being a more cheerful and vibrant city than previous games in the franchise, the daytime version of Palm City feels quite empty and lifeless, which ends up harming immersion. The lighting during the day is inferior, with little variation and a muted brightness that doesn't highlight the city's details as it should. The feeling is that the environment lost a bit of that visual charm that could make the city seem truly pulsating and inviting. In the development process, it seems that the team focused more on the nighttime part of the city, where the neon lighting and light effects truly shine and create a much more captivating and stylized atmosphere. This technical and artistic choice resulted in a much more striking Palm City at night, but one that is opaque and not very exciting when the sun is high. It is clear that filling the city with pedestrians or movement could impact performance and break the racing game atmosphere. But it would be more interesting to have daytime elements that also transmitted energy and visual diversity. This contrast between day and night, which works well in concept, fails a little in execution during the daytime, making the city seem almost like an empty scenario, which does not match the proposal of a vibrant place that the devs wanted to convey. The lack of movement and the simplified use of lighting and effects make the streets and neighborhoods during the day dull, which accentuates the feeling of repetition and lack of life in the open world. This bothered me because the setting is a fundamental part of creating that identification with the space where the player is racing, and this doesn't happen correctly during the day in Palm City. In technical development, the choice of the Frostbite engine brought advantages to the visual side, but also demonstrated notorious limitations, especially in managing lighting and rendering in different light conditions. Common problems appeared, such as late rendering and lack of realism in some light effects, which increases the feeling of artificiality during the day. The city in daylight ends up seeming underdeveloped, without the same realistic shine that other games using the same engine managed to deliver, harming immersion. Furthermore, the daytime setting presents a great repetition of textures and few elements that can break the visual monotony, such as the low number of interactive objects or scenario details that involve the player. This means that, although the map is quite large and full of points to explore, the feeling is of driving in similar scenarios, which ends up tiring over time. In this aspect, development could have invested in more visual diversity during the day to better balance with the richness of the nighttime part. Meanwhile, at night, Palm City explodes in neon, impressive light effects and a much more commercial and intense vibe, with busier streets and beautiful urban landscapes. The game truly shines in the nocturnal visuals, and at this point, the setting is a clear high point of development. It's as if the art and design team had reserved all their best cards for the nighttime scenario, leaving the daytime version somewhat secondary and less exciting. For me, this disparity reinforces the team's taste for cyberpunk aesthetics and the idea that night is when the real game happens. The daytime setting in Palm City is, in my opinion, the weakest side of the game's design, with muted lighting, little life, and a feeling of emptiness, which do not correspond to the initial proposal of a cheerful and vibrant city. The development of that environment seems to have been abruptly overshadowed by the nighttime setting, which is certainly more impactful and memorable. If I could give advice to the developers at the time of the game's development, it would be to better balance these two moments and bring more energy and details to the day, so that the open world of Palm City seems truly alive and interesting at any time. Need for Speed Heat presents a more malleable and flexible gameplay, especially in Drift, when compared to the 2015 game. In development, Ghost Games listened a lot to player feedback about the difficulty and unpredictability of the drift system in the 2015 version, which was considered too floaty and with little possibility of precise control. In Heat, the drift system was redesigned to offer more player control over the angle and speed of the car during corners, providing a more satisfactory and grippy experience in maneuvers, which for me is a clear and important advance. The drift in Heat is less exaggerated and more technical, with better response to accelerator and brake commands, allowing the player to hold the skid for longer and have a smoother transition between corners. This change makes the gameplay more accessible for those who like a more controlled style, while maintaining the emotion and adrenaline of street racing. I particularly valued this evolution, as it brought a greater sense of mastery over the car and allows investing in more precise strategies to win races and escape the police, unlike the more overwhelming experience of 2015, which was frustrating for me at many moments. In development, the attempt to make Drift more intuitive and pleasant was accompanied by adjustments to car tuning, which in Heat allows the player to make more specific modifications for drift, grip, or a middle ground without needing specific vehicles for each type of race, as happened before. This gave more flexibility to experiment with different styles and adapt to each type of event. For me, this contributed to a more personal and fun experience, as it gives the player the power to mold their car exactly the way they want to drive. Comparing with the 2015 game, Heat moves away from that feeling of floaty cars and erratic responses. In 2015, the lack of control in fast maneuvers and the unstable behavior of the cars bothered a lot, harming immersion and challenge. Heat, in turn, provides more firmness and precision to the steering wheel, even though it still uses an arcade style, remaining fun without becoming frustrating. This added malleability and drift represents for me a maturation of the series, indicating a more refined and careful development approach focused on gameplay. The gameplay of Need for Speed Heat, especially in drift, I found to be a clear evolution from the 2015 game, offering greater control, more customization options, and a system that works better for most players, even if it still has some flaws. This aspect shows a development more centered on the player's experience, seeking to make each curve a conquest and each police escape an exciting victory. For those who like drift, Heat is a step forward, with more malleability and a sense of mastery that makes all the difference in the gameplay. Need for Speed Heat brought notable improvements in off-road mechanics, representing an important advance compared to the previous game, where this part was practically neglected. In development, Ghost Games dedicated special attention to making the cars respond more realistically and precisely off the asphalt, something that before sounded strange and disconnected, almost as if the car were sliding without control, without any feeling of uneven terrain or difficulty in driving. This new off-road mechanic seeks to simulate the behavior of vehicles on different surfaces, such as dirt, gravel, or mud, with variations in grip, suspension, and acceleration, which directly affect car control. For me, this evolution gives a much greater sense of immersion and challenge, because the player needs to adapt their driving to the terrain, not being able to simply treat all races as if it were just accelerating on a smooth track. This expands the range of skills needed to master the game. In development, the use of specific off-road tuning, involving suspension, tires, and differential, helps to transform the car into a machine prepared for these difficult terrains, and the result is a car that responds tangibly and satisfactorily, unlike the vague feeling that existed before. The tactile and visual feedback during off-track driving conveys this difference, making each off-road race a unique and rewarding tactile experience. I personally found this difference fundamental to giving variety and consistency to the gameplay. However, despite these improvements, there are still evident limitations and areas for evolution. I noticed that certain cars are not sufficiently competitive in off-road events, and even though there is plenty of customization available, the rating system can take away some of the depth by standardizing vehicle performance generically. In development, it seems there was a delicate balance between accessibility and realism, which can frustrate players looking for a greater challenge or more detail in off-road physics. Furthermore, the fact that there are few off-road events compared to the total game is somewhat disappointing, especially because this feature had the potential to be widely explored on the Palm City map and surroundings. In the creative process, I imagine that time constraints or priorities led to this choice, but it is a point that somewhat compromises the feeling of a richer and more diversified open world in challenges. For me, the inclusion and improvement of the off-road mechanic is one of Need for Speed Heat's hidden successes, which delivers a more complete and varied experience to the player, allowing driving on terrains that truly require adaptation and technique. This differentiates the game from the competition and from previous titles in the franchise, showing greater care in the development of physics and an expansion of the original proposal focused only on urban races. The Need for Speed Heat soundtrack, in my opinion, is the worst in the franchise, a point that really bothered me during gameplay. While previous games in the series knew how to choose tracks that perfectly matched the atmosphere of speed and adrenaline, Heat opted for a repertoire mainly focused on contemporary hip-hop and rap, styles that for me do not match the frantic pace of a racing game, creating a big disconnect between the sound and the action on the screen. This sound choice makes me often feel like turning off the sound so as not to be bothered, which is not something I experienced with other games in the series. Furthermore, I felt that the use of the same songs, several times in a row, during different types of races and moments in the game increased auditory fatigue. The repetition of tracks does not help create a dynamic atmosphere. On the contrary, it tires and takes away part of the immersion. For me, the soundtrack should be capable of accompanying the intensity of the races, but in Heat's case, it seems more like an inconvenient background than an element that enhances the experience. It's not that there aren't fans of the soundtrack or players who like the chosen style. It is, without a doubt, a matter of personal taste. But, speaking from my point of view, this sound alignment doesn't work, and as someone who creates content, I eventually recommend to my viewers to leave the game sound off for a more pleasant experience. This shows how far the soundtrack is from what I consider fundamental for a title that depends so much on adrenaline and rhythm to engage. It's even curious that such a crucial part of the experience ended up being an Achilles heel, because memorable soundtracks have always been a hallmark of the Need for Speed franchise. The lack of care here seemed like a mistake that could have been avoided with more careful curation and a greater balance of musical genres. The Need for Speed Heat multiplayer initially showed interesting potential, bringing the possibility of races with other players and interactions that could strengthen the community around the game. However, over time, especially up to 2025, this potential was practically abandoned by the developers. The game stopped receiving significant updates, which contributed to a gradual emptying of the lobbies and players' interest in multiplayer. In development, Ghost Games and Electronic Arts focused more on other aspects of the title, and probably on new projects in the franchise, leaving Heat with minimal support. This lack of regular updates caused many players to migrate to other games, feeling that the multiplayer no longer offered new content, events, or improvements that kept engagement alive. For me, this is a negative point, because multiplayer could have been a great way to maintain the game's longevity and constantly increase its community. Despite the abandonment, there are still small and dedicated communities playing Heat in 2025, mainly on PC servers and through mods, which help to revive the multiplayer experience with different visual improvements and gameplay adjustments. Even so, this situation is quite distant from what is expected of a competitive and active multiplayer game, reinforcing the impression that Heat was left to its own devices after its launch. This absence of support is especially disappointing because the game had a solid foundation to create interesting multiplayer events, combining legal daytime races and illegal nighttime drag races in conjunction with other players, something that could have yielded a lot of content and competitiveness. The lack of updates left this potential far below expectations, and this clearly drove away a large part of the public looking for a more robust online experience. In my view, this situation with Heat's multiplayer reveals a planning failure and a lack of commitment to sustaining the game long-term. The multiplayer scenario is essential for games of this genre, and maintaining an active base would require constant events, fixes, and novelties, which simply did not happen. The community ended up feeling that the game suffered abandonment, which causes the title to lose relevance compared to competitors that invest heavily in this aspect. The closure of Ghost Games in February 2020 happened a few months after the launch of Need for Speed Heat, marking the end of the studio's trajectory as the main supplier of the franchise. This happened at a delicate moment when Ghost Games faced criticism and a troubled legacy due to controversial decisions in previous games and limited post-launch support. Electronic Arts then decided to transfer the development of the series to Criterion Games, which is historically very respected, not only for the Need for Speed franchise, but also for having developed classics like Burnout and the Need for Speed Hot Pursuit and Most Wanted games. Ghost Games was dissolved and began to act more as an engineering studio for the Frostbite engine, losing its status as the leader in the franchise's development. For me, this transition shows that the Heat project had many internal and external problems, reflecting in the game with limited support and a continuity gap that harmed the series' evolution. The feeling is that the game had legitimate potential, but was impacted by an unstable development structure and sudden changes. The abrupt change behind the scenes brought important consequences for the game and the community, which saw the lack of updates and gradual abandonment of multiplayer and other content. This unstable environment reinforced the perception of a troubled legacy, where the game did not receive the long and consistent support it deserved to consolidate its fan base. Although Heat launched some good ideas, the studio went through difficulties that harmed the game, leaving the legacy marked by controversies and abandonment. This transition evidenced challenges in the development and management of the franchise, impacting the path that Need for Speed would follow in the following years.
I could use that about now.
You and everyone else in this town.
Shut it down.